We live in a moment where outrage feels like the loudest language in the room, but loud doesn't always mean effective. In today's conversation, I sit down with world-class speaking coach Robert Begley to explore why persuasion beats force, why empathy disarms hostility, and why you can't hate someone into understanding you. If you've ever walked away from a conversation wishing it hadn't blown up, stick with me. Welcome back, my friends, to the Derate The Hate podcast. I'm your host, Wilk Wilkinson, your blue-collar sage, calming outrage and helping to navigate a world divided by fog and those who would spread that fear, outrage, and grievance. The Derate The Hate podcast is proudly produced in collaboration with Braver Angels, America's largest grassroots, cross-partisan organization working towards civic renewal. This podcast amplifies the mission that we share to foster a more respectful and united America where civic friendship thrives even when we disagree. Each week, through the power of story, conversation, and connection with incredible guests, we work to build bridges instead of barriers. Not to change minds on the issues, but to change how we see one another when we differ. Because, friends, it really is about bettering the world one attitude at a time. We did not create the hate, but together we can derate the hate. So be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, share it with a friend, and visit braverangels.org to learn how you can get involved in the movement to bridge the partisan divide. Friends, I am so incredibly grateful that you have joined me for another powerful Derate the Hate episode. So let's get to it. My guest today is Robert Begley, world-class speaking coach, author, and transformational communicator who works with everyone from entrepreneurs and executive leaders to people who've lived under oppressive regimes. Robert's work centers on one simple but powerful truth. How we speak matters just as much as what we say. In this conversation, we dig into why rhetoric rooted in outrage almost always backfires, and why rhetoric rooted in empathy is far more persuasive, durable, and human. We talk about how conversations escalate, how friendships get lost over shouting matches, and how quickly dialogue turns into force when purpose gets lost. We explore what Robert calls defusing the fuse, the practical tools that help disarm hostility before it explodes, and why curiosity, listening, and emotional discipline aren't signs of weakness, but true strength. If you've ever struggled to stay grounded in a hard conversation, if you've ever wondered how to stand firm without becoming hostile, this episode will give you language, clarity, and courage for a conversation when it matters most. Let's get into it with my friend Robert Begley. Here we go. All right, Robert Begley, welcome to the Derate the Hate podcast, my friend. It's good to see you today.
Thank you, Wilk. Good to be here today. I will just start by saying I love the title of your program and the theme of your program, because open conversations is what I'm all about and what I think the country needs at this time. So I really appreciate you having me here, and I've listened to several episodes and I just love the work that you're doing. So right off the bat, thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. I appreciate those kind words. And I'm grateful to have you here. Looking into the work that you've done, Robert, for the past several years, and as a world-class speaking coach, and me as somebody who obviously does a lot of speaking for a living, and and then I started looking at the different stuff, not just the speaking, but the things that the content of what you're speaking about really stood out to me. And there's just a number of things, Robert, that I want to get into and right away, because things in this country right now are quite heated when it comes to rhetoric and people not being able to have effective and meaningful conversations with people they disagree with. and I've looked at some of your body of work, and that there's a number of things there that align very well with the stuff that I do. So right away, I just want to jump in with a strong question for the DTH listeners, because I get this question quite often in the work that I do, in the depolarization space and in the speaking space, and that's, how, Robert, do people, when they engage in a conversation with somebody that they're certain that they disagree with,
Mm-hmm.
and right away that person, tries to, I guess, ambush them with some kind of inflammatory statement,
Mm-hmm.
or just some ugly thing.
Yeah.
How does that conversation continue? How can you then have that conversation without it devolving into some kind of shouting match? How can it still be an effective conversation? Because I know
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the things that you've talked about before, and that's where we're going to start, and then we're going to get into a whole bunch of other things. But I just want to tease it with that, because I think that's so hugely important.
Yes, it's important and relevant today, because sadly we do see that often. My first answer, Wilk, is what's your purpose in the conversation? Is it to persuade? Is it a friend you want to maintain a friendship with? Because many people have lost decades-long friendships over conversations that escalated to shouting matches. And how do we stay within reason in these conversations? Because that's the thing. There's two ways we can deal with people: by persuasion or by force. And when you are reduced to shouting or name calling, you are transitioning from trying to persuade to effectively force the person, at least verbally. Your tone is doing that. And that's just not successful. So I would have our audience ask themselves, what is your purpose in engaging with this person? Is it to salvage? First of all, is it somebody anonymous on the internet who can just
Right.
they can say whatever they want and just badger and have no repercussions? Because I think that is one of the biggest problems that we have. Whereas in face-to-face, it's not as commonly rancorous. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It is just reduced the amount. But when Thanksgiving is coming up here, that might be at dinner tables, family dinner tables, where there are differences. I maintain the position that I want to reason with the person. If we can, first of all, defining what is our goal, understanding what is our goal in this conversation. Is it to move the relationship forward? Is it to convert somebody? We're rarely going to convert somebody within the span of a few exchanges back and forth. These are oftentimes decades-long premises that it takes them a while to accept what they're accepting. So a few conversations with somebody who disagrees will likely not do that. But I like to think of just moving the needle a little bit. Hey, I never thought about that. And one way, and I'll let you jump in after this, is I actually do most of the questioning. I ask them, wow, how did you come to that conclusion? Enlighten me here, because from what I understand, I see it a little bit differently, but show me the logical chain that you followed to come to that conclusion. And oftentimes there's signs, right? Have you tried that? And what's the reaction you got?
No, that's absolutely right, Robert. I mean, when you engage with curiosity and ask people, not just what they believe, but why they believe it, and you make sure that person feels seen and heard in that conversation, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the starting point of saying, okay, what's my purpose in this conversation? Because quite often, and I'm somebody who used to get involved in those meaningless shouting matches online, or kind of rhetorical shouting matches online with people I didn't know, about stuff I didn't know enough about, and trying to change people's mind, not through persuasion, but through rhetorical force. And And it just does not work. I mean, one of the things that I talk about quite often now is I'm not here to change people's minds. I'm here to open them.
Yes.
And how do you open their mind? How do you open their mind to the idea that what they're saying may or may not be right, but we can at least have a civil conversation about it? That's to make sure that that person feels listened to, make sure that person feels heard, make sure that they're comfortable in this conversation so that they will share with you not just what they believe, but why they believe it.
Perfect. We are 100% aligned on that.
Yeah. And Robert, so and this is where I want to go with this, because I think there are a number of things that we're going to be aligned on, but I think it's hugely important when it comes to conversation. You mentioned, as of the date of this recording, we've got some holidays coming up. We're recording this right before Thanksgiving, but then we've got other holidays coming up as well. People are going to be visiting with family. People are going to be having conversations, and you've got a book out called Voices of Reason. And there's just a number of different things within, Lessons for Liberty's Leaders. But, there's a number of different things in this book that I want to point out as being very important, because as we have these conversations, whether these conversations are about something in history, something, currently happening in current events, something within popular culture, there are a lot of different things that we can think about. And I know you've got a number of different, steps and stages and things that we can talk about as far as how we have these conversations. But one of the things that stood out to me, and I want you to dive into this, because there's kind of three things there that you talk about. And that's, these three principles that Aristotle talked about, and that's ethos, logos, and pathos.
Yes.
The character, the logic, and then your emotional resistance to things, in a conversation. And I don't think a lot of people in modern day conversations really break it down, but those three things are hugely important when we think about how we interact with other people. I talk a lot about emotional intelligence, not allowing our emotions to dictate our actions. But that should not mean that you're like this emotional automaton. There's a right time for emotion.
No robot.
Right? So dive into that for me, would you, Robert?
Yes.
Because the ethos, logos, pathos, Aristotle principles are hugely important in how we interact with other people.
So one thing, if you know history, Wilk, which I know that you do, it often repeats itself. And back in Aristotle's day, we use the term rhetoric. Often today, when we say, "Oh, that's rhetoric," is that a compliment when we use that term? No, it's like, "Oh, that's gibberish." That's
a pejorative of some sort.
And back in Aristotle's day, similarly, there was a group called the Sophists, and they would go around, and their goal was to win arguments at any price and to charge people. They were kind of like snake oil salesmen. And Aristotle said, no, we need to reframe this term, rhetoric. Let's approach it logically, scientifically, and we'll have these three pillars. The ethos is the moral character of the speaker. Oftentimes it's also said as the credibility, but you can't really be credible without a strong moral character. And that is, so if you don't uphold a moral character, if you're sitting in an audience and you don't really have respect for the speaker, you're probably not going to trust them or really believe what they're saying. Similarly, in a conversation as well, because everything that applies on the stage or in presentation mode can apply in one-to-one conversations as well. And so that's what I think is the primary, is the moral character of the speaker. Now, the logos is the logical argument. Point A leads to point C, backed up by evidence, as we talked about earlier, and then a conclusion that you can follow this chain of reasoning. And then again, you and I are on the same page with the pathos, in the sense that Aristotle says people come to a presentation, a speech, or conversation with their own, for lack of a better term, baggage. They are in an emotional state. Our goal as persuasive speakers is to gauge where they are in that state and to gradually bring them closer to our position. So going right back to your first question, gauge where they are, find a way to not manipulate them, because we do see that. We do definitely see incredibly emotional speakers. In 1933, there was one great example I talk about in my book, who was all pathos, all rabid emotion, but no logos or ethos, about Adolf Hitler, in case anybody doesn't know this.
Yeah.
And so, but Aristotle says, gauge their emotional condition and try to bring them closer to your position, not through manipulation, but by empathizing with them, having a case, engaging in reflective questions. As a professional speaker, I say a good speech is not a monologue, it's a dialogue between us.
Sure.
It's not someone up here speaking down, lecturing to the audience. Those days are past. They had their time. Today, it's more eye-level conversation instead of like we're doing now, a dialogue instead of a monologue. And so what I do in my book is I show these 7 different speeches. I analyze them through the lens of Aristotle's rhetoric. Hey, this is why Lincoln, and I mentioned the value of knowing history. Today's November 19th, anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. You and I both have a background going to Gettysburg. It's a somber mood. You can't be very happy. You can't be cheerful there, knowing the blood that was shed over the issue of slavery. Nobody says this in history books. America is the only country to fight a war to defeat and eradicate slavery. That has never happened in human history, because we were not living up to the principles that we wrote about in our Declaration and Constitution. And so in my book, I say, and here's another history repeating itself, because we kind of feel like we're in another civil war. You know, it's not geographical, it's ideological, where people don't even talk to each other. But I don't think, you know, the country was literally torn apart in the 1860s.
That's right.
And it's not as bad now. We often over dramatize what we're going through like no one ever did. But again, I said back in Aristotle's day, there were bad rhetoric. And 150 years ago, there was a civil war. So it's like we've kind of been there, but let's learn. How about we learn from the past?
Yeah, and this is, and you bring up a good point, and that's, you know, when we are talking about things today, and language means things. The words that we use mean things, and we often find that people are using words and rhetoric that are just overboard, making things out to be much worse than they are, calling everything an existential threat. Mm-hmm. You know, when a particular speaker, politician, media, social influencer, whatever, calls everything that they disagree with racism or white supremacy and things like that. I mean, what it does is it does a huge disservice to the gravity of that particular term.
Yes.
You know, nobody's going to deny that right now there are white supremacists out there. Nobody's going to deny that there are racists out there. But in our rhetorical arguments, when people use emotionally charged words like racist, misogynist, you know, homophobe, xenophobe, calling everything that they disagree with white supremacy, or blaming every particular thing that has not gone right for a particular, you know, demographic of people, a particular thing, that type of rhetoric, that emotionally charged rhetoric, ruins the conversation. It ruins it. You now don't have a solid footing to build that conversation upon, because that emotional resistance that you were talking about has now been damaged at its foundation.
Yeah. A very important point. And actually, Wilk, if I could go a step further, the difference between words and action. When we were kids, I grew up in the Bronx hearing this expression, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never harm me.
Right.
Today, the mere fact of calling somebody something, they take as such an insult. They feel like their world is shattered, and therefore now they can go with force. I mentioned earlier there's force or persuasion. They go straight to a forcible reaction and blame the other side for forcing them, quote unquote, with their words. And so I think it's important to separate those two as well, words and action.
I think that's hugely important. And one of the things that I say quite often, Robert, is we cannot hate somebody into believing what we believe. And I think that force versus persuasion thing is a very, very important distinction to make, because anybody who thinks that they can hate or berate somebody into believing what they believe, again, this kind of goes back to what we were saying before. I don't try to change anybody's mind on anything. I try to open people's mind to the idea that their certainty is standing in the way of a broader, thought bubble, right? I mean, the idea, when we are certain about things, Robert, we tend to close out the idea that anything that we hadn't thought of before could possibly be true. And that's why the power of conversation, again, and I want to get into, because you talk in your book, obviously, Voices of Reason. Again, you talk about these magnificent seven orators in American history. You already mentioned one, obviously, Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, but there are several throughout history that have been able to make incredible, through the power of persuasion in conversation, not the power of force, not hating people into believing what they believe. I mean, Martin Luther King, I believe, is Martin Luther King Jr. is another one in your list of Magnificent Seven. But I mean, one of the greatest things that Martin Luther King Jr. ever said was, hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Obviously one before the other, I screwed up the quote. But regardless, the point is still the same, is when we think of great orators, when we think of great people throughout history that have used the power of conversation through persuasion to make great strides for humanity, it wasn't people that were trying to hate people into believing what they believe. Kind of like Adolf Hitler, like you said, 1933. He was all about pathos, but had no logos or ethos. Talk about that. Talk about those Magnificent Seven.
Thank you. Well, so let's start with the two that you just mentioned. First, with Martin Luther King Jr. Amazing speech, probably the greatest speech of the 20th century. I Have a Dream. And the title of my chapter on him is called Moral Character versus Skin Color, because he says it right there. I hope that someday my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Today, in conversations that you have, are people more obsessed with skin color or moral character? I'll just ask you that. I'll ask your audience that. It should be, if we're following a man of peace, a man of nonviolence, okay, again, going with that reason versus the persuasion and reason versus violence and force. So that's MLK. That's his amazing, just a part of it, just to give a little tidbit there. And then who I call the voice of reason, in the mid-20th century, the height of the world is at war. And that's where Churchill steps on the stand and says, we must fight. We will never surrender. We will fight on the beaches, and gives a reasoned case to the British public, saying victories are not won by evacuation. This was after Dunkirk. It's a great movie, dramatizes that they escaped from Dunkirk, but he's like, no, this is going to be tough. But by being steadfast and having moral character, the character that Churchill had, because he had been for decades a leader in voice and in action, And so he was able to succeed, of course, with the help of the Americans. And I have a nod to America because the way he ends that famous speech is that if we won't do it alone, then the new world will save the old world, meaning the United States of America will come in. And he was American by his mother was born in the United States. So he had great respect for America, traveled when he was young. Lincoln was a massive fan of Abraham Lincoln, traveled to the United States after the Civil War when he was young. So here's an example of steadfast leadership, but also the pathos that he used. So he gave the logical argument, and then the pathos, the empathy, was that it's for you, it's for the British people, it's for civilization that we will not surrender to these tyrants. Okay. And in fact, the title there is Tyrants versus a Leader. Okay. Because the first tyrant of the 20th century was Vladimir Lenin, who used the platform similarly to rile up the masses with hatred for, your title is deep.
Emotionally charged rhetoric.
Yes.
Yeah.
But always hating somebody, hating the rich, hating someone. When people are obsessed, coming away from the book for a second, when people are obsessed with what somebody else has, what does that say about themselves? They don't really like themselves. In this era of quote self-esteem, you shouldn't. It doesn't bother me. I grew up poor. I'm number 8 out of 9 kids, squeezed into a New York City apartment and on welfare. I didn't hate the rich. I wanted to be one. I said to myself, I'm going to strive. I'm going to have a paper route. I'm going to pump gas. I will not be poor. When I leave home at age 18, I will never again be on food stamps. And so I didn't say I'm going to sit back and, let's kill billionaires because they're all evil. No. So we have this choice here to take these actions. Let me come back. Patrick Henry, we haven't spoken about, but the first voice in the New World calling for independence. How does he start his speech in St. John's Church? Gentlemen, he praises his opponents. So again, this is what you're all about. Listening, praising them. The gentlemen, the very well-respected gentlemen here who have spoken before me, they're going on their principles. And I think that's noble of them. But then he builds his case for independence. No, the fleets are across, they don't want peace when they have all these ships outside of Boston. They want subjugation. So we have to rise up. And as a speaker now, okay, this is, talk about the value of the spoken word as opposed to the written word. If Patrick Henry wrote in calligraphy and handed out 30 pamphlets, to those people in St. John's Church, the impact would have been very limited. Here's how this is what attracted me to the spoken word, Wilk, how you can really rile up a crowd for good. 2 arms, 7, 6 of the signers of the Declaration were in that church when he spoke. George Washington was ready. So this is the power of the spoken word, the ethos, logos, pathos that I talk about in the book. So that's a few of the others who I mentioned of Magnificent Seven.
Yeah, and thank you for pointing those out. I mean, the power of the spoken word, I think, Robert, it cannot be overstated, and I'll say it again: the power of conversation can't be overstated, and how we interact with people. Especially, I mean, you're going to talking about Patrick Henry and trying to use the power of persuasion through conversation for something like the idea of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, we're here on the eve of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence here in the United States of America, and people need to be thinking about that and thinking about what they were going through 250 years ago right now, and how we had to use that power of persuasion, how the founding fathers of this country had to use the power of persuasion, not necessarily, not the power of force. They weren't trying to hate their way into starting a brave new country. They had to use the power of persuasion for that. One of the things that I want as we get close, I mean, like
Mhm.
I said, this was going to go very fast, but as we round out our time here, Robert, one of the things that people often lose sight of, that I try to highlight in so many of the talks that I give, and it is, listening to somebody that you disagree with, listening with intention, listening with empathy. Empathy is a word that you've
Mhm.
brought up a number of times in this conversation. And empathy is not agreement. Listening with intention does not signal agreement. But listening with intention, listening with empathy, engaging with empathy in a conversation with somebody that you disagree with is a hard thing to do, but its importance can't be overstated. Let's round out our time, talk a little bit more about that,
Sure.
and then we'll round out with telling people where they can find Voices of Reason.
Okay. I have one little minor last thing, if I could squeeze in after the empathy.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So I can't really add much more than what you said. Having empathy, listening. My mother would say when someone when someone only waited in our family, if there was ever silence, someone would jump in, and I would complain because I hated being interrupted. When I would think before I would speak, and whenever I'd interrupt, I'd shut down. She said, "Honey, they're listening with their mouth."
All right.
So you know what that means, right?
Yeah.
So empathetic. All their brain is thinking about what they're going to say next at the next.
They're going to say next.
And
yep.
So I learned the hard way. I became a black belt in passive aggression, where if you interrupt me, I'm tuning out. Okay. So, but that being the case, Wilk, I think it's important to have empathy, even if you disagree, to show some kind of respect. I love what you're doing here. So I'm going to just shift a little bit. Immigrants. Okay. It's a hot button issue. I coach immigrants who have risked their lives to come to the United States. I help them tell their story in English. One man stood 20 feet from the tanks at Tiananmen Square. And we did it. You mentioned Declaration of Independence. Every July 4th, I do a Zoom-based reading. We go around taking a paragraph each, and many are from international. So the American ideal is global. I'm coaching a group of student leaders in Burundi, Africa. English is their third language. We're going chapter by chapter through this book, over 11 weeks. So the point here, the broadest point of what you're helping to do is show the American ideal, the American dream is broader than these 50 United States. And a lot of people are American in spirit, in the good sense. And Martin Luther King, that's the other thing. He says, my dream is tied into the American dream. And I think that's something that you are promoting as well, is having these conversations. So a bookend that by just transitioning my book. You can find it on Amazon, 99 cents on Kindle version, Voices of Reason, Lessons from American Leaders, Robert. Speaking with Purpose is my business name, speakingwithpurpose.llc, because from my first answer to you, what is your purpose when you get into a conversation? Is it to rant? Is it to listen with your mouth? Or is it to engage in a reason, persuasion, affable, and ideally I want a flourishing society. And that can only exist where people deal with each other by means of persuasion and not by means of force.
Oh, that's absolutely right, man. Listening with intention is the right way.
Yes.
Listening with the intention to understand, not to respond,
Yes.
is always going to be a better way to make sure that you are also listened to when you are speaking with purpose. Robert Begley, this has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you,
a conversation that I knew was going to go so fast. So we'll have to save more for the next time. But yeah, the book is Voices of Reason, and people need to get out there and find it. They can find all that information right here in the show notes for this episode. Robert Begley, it's been a pleasure, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Friends, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. And if there's anything in this episode that provided exceptional value to you, please make sure to hit that share button. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to subscribe to get the Derate The Hate podcast sent to your email inbox every week. We really are better together, so please take a moment to visit braverangels.org and consider joining the movement towards civic renewal and bridging our political divides. This is Wilk wrapping up for the week saying get out there, be kind to one another, be grateful for everything you've got, and remember, it's up to you to make every day the day that you want it to be. With that, my friends, I'm going to back on out of here and we will catch you next week. Take care.